Welcome back. In this next session, we'll be going through the commands in Minitab to do statistical process control. I'm going to apply several different control charts, or look at several different control charts in this session, including X-bar range, individual moving range, as well as our attributes, P and U charts. Now, the nice thing is, once we learn to do a couple of charts, a lot of things start to become repetitive. So when we learn one, we get to essentially learn many different ways in which we can do that. We just interpret them a little bit differently. Among the main skills we want to be able to have for this class is I want to be able to, first of all, create either a variable or an attribute SPC chart. Variable SPC charts are going to depend on what our subgroup size is. If it's a subgroup size of 1, we do individual moving range. If it's a subgroup size up to 10, we do X bar and range. I'm not going to cover the X bar and S chart, but it's certainly a very easy to apply once we learn the X bar range approach. And then for attribute charts, we'll focus in on the P chart and the U chart. And again, other charts we can do in Minitab will be very similar. In addition to creating a chart, we want to be able to make sure we know how to add tests for out of control. Minitab has a default one, but we can change that to up to 4 tests, as I discuss in lecture. Sometimes when we run a big data set, we want to have our control limits based on only the initial run of things, and then use the later for process monitoring. So if I want to control which particular subgroups are used to establish the limits, I will go through that, as well as if I want to remove an out of control point for maybe there was some type of special cause that I don't want to be included in my control limits. Then I want to go through this idea of using stages or split SPC charts. This is a nice little feature that we have inside of Minitab where we can kind of show a before and after effect. Now I'm going to do this the long way at the beginning, and then eventually I'll show you the Minitab Assistant, which would, for some of you, make it a little bit easier. The problem with starting with the Assistant is that we don't always know all the different options. So we'll go through the different options that we have, and then in practice, we may just want to use the Minitab Assistant, and whatever the default output from Minitab Assistant is may be sufficient. Other times we want to have more control over that. All these different skills are going to apply to every single chart. I'm only going to show examples along the way, but anything I show you for one chart will be applicable to others. We're going to begin by looking at variable data. And let's say we have subgroups of size n equals 5. The example doesn't really matter, but we're taking order fill times. And we have samples of 5 per day. And so each subgroup has 5. Now, I want to pay attention to the type of data format we have. In this case, the data is in the format of a subgroup is in a row of columns, meaning that we have several columns, and if I take across that full row, that will represent a subgroup. That's different than if I have all the data in one giant column. I'll show you that later on because we want to be able to handle either format, but this is going to be one of the formats that we want to deal with. Now, the summary statistics in yellow, Minitab is going to compute those for us. I'm just showing them to you so you can match them up to the graph, but these are things that Minitab is going to compute. All we really need to know is the data. All right, we're going to begin by going through some different control charts. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over and get some data as well as move into Minitab. There is an Excel file that comes with this particular module. And if we go over here and we take the data, and again, I don't need the yellow stuff. I can just copy the main data. I'm going to hit copy for that. And then I'm going to jump into Minitab and I'm going to paste my data. In this case, again, we have a subgroup going across a row. Let's begin by making a X-bar range chart. Here we'll go to Stat Control Charts. And Minitab is nice where they give all the control charts under the same heading, as well as giving us subgroups, individuals, attributes to help us pick the right chart. If we begin by doing a variable chart for subgroups, the top up there is X bar R. Usually we make things in pairs. Minitab will let us do these individually, but we will typically make these in pairs. Please note that this IMR-RS chart is different than an IMR chart. So that's a little bit. We're going to focus, though, first of all, on the X-bar range chart. We'll go ahead and click on that. And I'm going to hit this drop down just because it's important to see the two different formats. One format is all the observations are in one column. The other one is observations for a subgroup are in a row of columns. And if I click on that, Minitab will change the dialog box a little bit because it's going to be able to determine the subgroup size based on how many columns I give it for this format. All right, to enter our data, we're going to go ahead and select the first one. You can hold the Shift key down and select the last one to highlight all of them, or you can do them one at a time. I'll do that one more time as a reminder for you. So I go to Stat, Control Charts, X-bar Range. We'll put that in a subgroup across. Click on the first one, hold the Shift key down, and move them all into the main dialog box. Now we're going to go through a couple of the X-bar R options. If I click on X-bar R options, the first thing I want to show you is the Under Estimate tab. We're going to notice here that we're going to use the R-bar method. In lecture notes, this is the approach I have. It should be the default in your version, but if your version has a different setting, you want to make sure that that is set in R-bar if you want to match my lecture notes and assignments. Then, if we click on Tests, you will see that the first 4 tests are the tests that we're going to use as standard in this course. You can actually go to your preferences inside of Minitab and set this up, but if you're using a floating license, you may have to keep doing this. Now, once we go ahead and hit OK, and we hit OK again, Minitab is going to create a X-bar R chart for you. And it should match what I've shown to you in the slides. And if you get points or subgroup 9 and subgroup 12, they're both out of control. They have little ones above them because they have failed rule number 1, which is more than 3 sigma away. So out above the upper control limit or below the lower control limit would be how I should say that. All right, now, for example, maybe you have found out that these 2 particular subgroups were some special cause, or you made a measurement error, or someone dropped the part, or did something that shouldn't be there, and you want to go ahead and exclude those points. What you can do is we can go back and rerun the tool. That's the little symbol up here, or you can hit the Control E for the same thing. We'll click on that last thing, and then we go to X-bar R options, and then we're going to the, oh, I'm sorry, I want to be careful here. If I go to the data options, what I'm going to do here is I am going to exclude, and in this case, I'm going to exclude rows 9 and 12. Now, I have this little option here to either leave a gap or not leave a gap. This is totally user preference, but if I go ahead and hit the leave gap there, I can go ahead and hit OK. It will rerun the chart, but this time where I remove points, it has left a gap. Now, I could also go back there and leave that and kind of smush it together like they never existed. Let's go ahead and do that. If I rerun the tool, so I just hit the Control E or the little dialog up there to rerun it. Under Data Options, I have the row numbers 9 and 12. This time I will uncheck the box. Go ahead and hit OK. And you will notice that Minitab redoes this as if those points never existed. There's logical arguments for both ways. If they really were completely ridiculous points because of some measurement error and you want to just remove them altogether, that's perfectly fine. What I just showed you was the data in a subgroup across a row. I'm going to jump back to my Excel file, and if I scroll over a little bit, I have data in stacked format. And what you're going to notice here is everything is in one giant column. So this time I'm just going to go over here, and I'm going to take all the data from one giant column, come back over to Minitab, and we're going to go ahead and paste that in. This time we have fill time in a single column, and we have a column called the subgroup ID. Now when I go to Stat, Control Charts, X-bar Range, if I flip this button over to All Observations in one column, now I'll put in my fill time as that one column. And then, very important here, it asks me for the subgroup size. Now, I can either enter a constant, such as 5, because every 5 is a new subgroup. Or what I really prefer to do if I have it is I have a label column that has the subgroup ID. And if I go to the worksheet, I have 1, then 2, then 3. This is the subgroup ID. When I do the data options here, I am going to come back and not exclude anything. I'll go ahead and hit OK, and I get back to my original graph that I made. Again, we got to be able to have both formats. I will give you assignments or questions in both, and we want to be able to go back and forth just because we get data in different ways. The last thing I want to show you in terms of variable charts is if I went to Stat, Control Charts, and I want to do an individual moving range, I would click on Variable Charts for Individuals, and the very top one is the IMR. If I click on this graph, I don't have to worry anymore about stacked and across a row because I just have one sample for each subgroup. Let's say I just pick a sample. I'm going to go ahead and pick sample number 1. And all I'm doing there is say, if I want to make an individual moving range chart on only the first sample that I have in my data set. And again, if I go to IMR options, if I click on the tests, I can default this or set this up to be the first 4 tests. And if I go ahead and do that, hit OK, I will get a result. In this case, number 9 comes up to be out of control. If you're wondering, well, how come the other one can be out of control as well? Well, we took less data and we have a different look at it. So sometimes things move in, move out of control depending on how I set that up. So we want to set this up to be the most appropriate. But anyways, that's an individual moving range chart. It's a pretty straightforward one, so you'll be able to usually do that one pretty easily. If I jump back to the PowerPoint a second, I just went through and I have screen snapshots for these different examples that I just went through, getting up to the individual moving range chart. All right, in the next section, we're going to go through what do I do if I have attribute data. Now I have a new data set where I have defects for each certain number of inspected units as well as the number defective. If I'm counting defects, then I'll use a U chart. If I'm doing the defective, I will use a P chart. For this one, we're going to go over and we're going to open up or back to our Excel file, and I'm going to switch over to where it says fiber optics. Now I'm going to just go ahead and copy all the data here at one time just to save me a step later. Probably getting pretty good at this by now. I will even make a file new worksheet. And I now have the attribute data on my Minitab worksheet. Now when I go ahead and do this, let's begin by doing, say, a U chart. Here we would go to Stat, control charts, but now we have attributes. The two most common ones are P and U. If we do a U chart, in this particular case, if we're counting defects, my variable is the defects, and the subgroup size is going to be the number inspected. Whenever we do this, we're going to have a count of the number of defects column and then a number of inspected. The software will compute the U sub I, or the defects per unit per subgroup. Now, when I go over to U chart options, I get a very similar look as before. And this time, if I go to tests, I will notice that I have the same first 4 tests. There are some other tests that only apply to variable control charts, but the first 4, these are known as what are called Schuhart charts, and they apply to many different ones are available to us. We will go ahead and hit OK, and hit OK again, and we should get a U chart. Now, if we get a U chart and I turned on rule number 4, so I get a little 4 there, meaning it's going up and down, and a rule number 1 violation down here at the bottom. But this would be my example of the U chart. Again, the U chart has varying control limits anytime the number of inspected units per subgroup is also varying. Now, the next thing I want to do is talk about the case where, let's say we want to fix our control limits and then keep collecting data in the future. And I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint for a second. And what I'm going to do here is, in this slide, I'm showing you that, let's say we want to look at defects. And this time we're going to have a column called pre-post and for defects. And we want to look at just them for the first 20 subgroups. So move back into Minitab. I am going to do my repeat to where I have defects and inspected, but this time I'm going to put in defects pre-post and inspected pre-post. I've changed the variables, and if you look at the Excel file, all I've done is I now have 30 subgroups instead of 20 in my total data file. But what I want to do is I'm going to go to U chart options and estimate, and I am going to only use 1 through 20. Now, I could exclude the additional ones, but I'm going to oftentimes do this as the initial ones I want to be my control limits. We'll go ahead and put that in as 1 through 20. We hit the OK button and OK again, and we come back and we see our results. Now, this one's kind of interesting because we can clearly see a change in the process. Again, these control limits are based on the first 20 only, and that's why we have such a big shift over there. Now, here's an example where, although we're out of control, this is a good out of control. This area down here where we have all these ones means that we have fewer defects per unit. So we're actually happy about that one. Now, one more thing I want to show you with, if I want to show this to my boss and say, you know what, not only do I want to show you that we've improved, I now want to establish new limits moving forward. I can do that by doing what's called a split SPC chart or stages SPC. We're going to do this by coming back to our same chart. Be a little careful here because under estimate, I'm going to come back and use all the data. So I've cleared it back out. Under U chart options, I'm going to go to where it says stages. And under stages, I have a variable called period. And I can have this with each new value of the period, or I could type in when I have, I could use the first occurrence of some label. I could type that in. In this case, we have a baseline and a post-improvement period. Now, one more thing. Under display, I'm going to display the control limit and center line for all stages. This is going to put both the before and after effect on the chart. We'll go ahead and hit OK and OK. And Minitab is going to come back and give us a nice split chart. Now, sometimes you got to move these around. I'm just grabbing the labels and I'm moving them a little bit so that I can read them for somebody else. But here you can see the baseline period. Here was our performance, and then the post period, here is our performance. And we've clearly made a significant improvement, as well as we have a stable process moving forward. All right, the last thing I want to show you is the shortcut, the quicker way. The quickest way to do this is to go to the Minitab Assistant. And if we go to a Minitab Assistant and we do a control chart, Minitab is going to come back and give us some different options. Let's say we pick the P chart. We haven't done that yet, so we'll go ahead and pick that. If we do the P chart, I could come over and says, what is the number of defective items column? And that word defective, helping me to recognize that I'm using a binary, 0s and 1. I'm going to go ahead and put in the defective. Then it's going to say enter a constant size for all subgroups or enter a column. In this case, we have a column, the inspected. And then it says, how will you determine your control limits? And we're going to estimate them from the data. Now, all of a sudden, when I did this, I get this really nice thing. Minitab right away comes in and says, hey, you have an out of control point. Do you want to include this or do you want to exclude this? If you wanted to, you could go ahead and omit it right away, and it's going to omit that out of control point. If I go ahead and hit the OK button, I'm going to go ahead and hit no here. And Minitab is going to come back and it's going to run the analysis. And we won't go into the details of this, but you will get all kinds of additional analysis when you do that, including some assessments of a report card. If you have any concerns, it's also giving you concerns about sample size if you have them, or concerns about the way you have set this up. As an example, it even gives you some choices for alternatives. Again, we can use the assistant for any of the tools, but we recognize that we lose some of the flexibility when we use the assistant. Okay, that's all I'm going to cover in this module. You have to practice a little bit, but usually after you do a couple of charts, you start to get the routine down and things will go quite smoothly for you. Good luck. Thank you.